Hello and welcome to EdPsych 501 screencast number 2. So I've learned a couple things since doing the first screencast. I'm going to try to limit the number of clicks you hear as I go through this. And you'll be happy to know that this screencast, well, number one, it's covering fewer topics, so that's one of the reasons it's shorter. But it will ultimately be shorter. So the material we're covering today is in chapters 4 and 5 of the text. We do not cover chapter 6, which is the ethics in the screencast. There are other resources for you to look at in order to get that material, a supplemental material to what you've read in the text. So for today we'll be covering problems and purposes and literature reviews. So why don't we get started? Alright, so one of the important distinctions that the authors of the text make is that there are differences between problems and purposes. And when you read other texts that introduce you to educational research methods or social science research methods, they won't always make that distinction. So right off the hop, I would like to start by saying that problems and purposes are slightly different, extremely related, but subtly different in a way that matters. So today we'll be going over the steps for identifying a research question or hypothesis. This is all related to problems and purposes, by the way. We'll also go over what is a research problem, characteristics of well-chosen problems, sources of problems, narrowing from broad to the specific, so the steps involved in that, and also what are our purpose statements. Steps to identifying a research question or hypothesis. So essentially, the way we use problems and purposes is in order to identify research questions and hypotheses. We went over some material regarding research questions and hypotheses in the previous screencast and readings, and this is related in the sense that in order to be able to get to the point of writing a research question or hypothesis, you need to have identified the problem and written out a purpose statement. So initially, we start by identifying an area of interest, a broad topic area. Then we review the literature and narrow ourselves into a specific problem. Then we move on to formulating a statement of purpose for our research, and finally using that to inform the writing of questions and hypotheses. So what exactly is a research problem? It's an issue or broad identification of concern within your area of interest. So it states a problem and provides a researcher with a general direction in pursuing a project. And the key point with this slide is that we're still in the realm of being quite broad. The problem is stated in a way that connects to a broader literature and sets you up to be able to narrow to something more specific. Well-chosen problems are of interest to yourself as a researcher, but also to the wider educational community. And the educational community is specific to your domain of study, obviously. Depending on the discipline you're in, you're going to be focusing in that area. It has to have practical and theoretical import, and it shouldn't be value-based. So we're not trying to determine whether some philosophy or approach is better. And finally, well-chosen problem can actually be studied feasibly, practically, and ethically. So feasibly means that in order to answer the question appropriately, there are methods that are available at your disposal. Practically means that it's not going to cost $1 million to do. And ethically, of course, we aren't going to be putting people in harm to answer our questions. Sources of problems come from other projects, things you've been working on where tangents emerge, and those are the genesis of a new question. They come out of testing theories, so reflecting on how things are currently being done and maybe potentially coming up with thoughts on new ways of doing them. They obviously come from a reading of the literature. So just becoming interested in something, you do end up reading literature. And once you do that, you could begin to start thinking of replicating or verifying findings. So is there something that you've read that you're critical of that you think that a better design or a different type of population might lead to different results? We also would replicate simply to strengthen the validity of findings. So if a study was done using a weak method or with a non-generalizable sample, then we might want to we might believe that the findings are true, but we want to show that they're also generalizable or valid across other methods. And then I've mentioned generalizability, but also to check for changes in our understanding over time. Introduction of new variables or new ways of thinking about the way the world works might change the question slightly, and this might require replication. We also look to practical experience, and I think from an educational standpoint, this is probably going to be the most likely source. If you're situated within a faculty, working, doing service, evaluating the effectiveness of the program, a lot of the research questions and problems will emerge from practical issues that we're dealing with on a daily basis. How do we prove to the accreditation board that we're effectively delivering the curriculum and that students are satisfied and they're coming out competent? So I think a lot of health science educational researchers who are situated within faculties will rely on practical experience, either as educators or as administrative service type contributors. So then there's also your colleagues, your courses that you take, any additional research you're being exposed to. These are all sources. And so mainstream media may be another source for research problems, the initial genesis of a research problem. There are stories every day about whether or not things like vaccinations are causing negative outcomes, or whether or not our health science professionals are trained to the extent that they need to be to deal with the emerging health problems of society. And so that can be a very rich source of problems. And of course, there's an appetite, if it's already being presented in the media, to hear more about the issue. So it's a very good source for problems. So what is a research purpose? So it should say what is a research purpose statement, because essentially the problem is this broad description of an issue in an area of interest to yourself. Whereas the purpose statement is really the intent of the study. It's directly related to the research questions that will follow, and it's a much more specific statement about what you intend to actually research. And so it's a little more narrow than simply situating the reader in a broad problem. So what are the steps for identifying problems and then purpose statements? Well, again, we start with our broad area of interest, and here are some examples. Admissions procedures, something that's applicable across health sciences. Faculty mentorship, an issue that doesn't just pop up in health sciences, but across all different kinds of faculties. And something that might be more specific to the profession, the health science professions, teaching empathy in health sciences. So these might be broad areas of interest to yourself that you'd like to study further, and that's where we would start. Then we need to narrow to a more specific problem. So we would read the literature, we would think about our practical context, we would narrow it down to something that we can start to ask a question about. So relating back to the 3 examples earlier, we might narrow it down to something like from admissions procedures down to predicting success in communications-based courses. And then thinking about mentorship again, the relationship between academic mentorship and productivity. Is there a relationship? And then what about undergraduate student experience of empathy education? So again, relating back to those 3 initial broad topics. Things are starting to get a little bit more specific. So in the last example, we're talking now about the experience of empathy education, rather than simply just teaching empathy in health sciences. Finally, we get to the point of narrowing it to a question or a hypothesis. So again, relating back to the 3 examples. So the first one is a hypothesis. Standardized interview scores will predict success in communications courses better than incoming GPA. So after I narrowed it down further, my review of the literature led to this hypothesis. Then, going back to the mentorship one, what is the relationship between faculty perceptions of mentorship effectiveness and academic productivity? So now we've got some specific variables being thrown around, a question about the relationship between them, and a way to sort of move forward and develop our methods. So how might I measure perceptions of mentorship and effectiveness? How am I going to define academic productivity? Those are all the next steps that build off of this specific research question. And then finally, a more qualitative research question: how do undergraduate nursing students experience an integrated empathy curriculum? Moving from simply talking about teaching empathy in health sciences to how students experience empathy education, now down to a specific targeted population and a specific type of empathy education, some kind of integrated empathy curriculum. So what I've provided here are examples, and I'm not going to read through these, but this is the first paragraph of a study published in Journal of Educational Psychology, and the first sentences that are bold would be the broad problem. And then the last sentences that are bolded are the statements of purpose. So please pause the screencast, read through this example, and get a sense for what we mean by problems and purpose statements, and how they might look in a published study. So you can see it doesn't take much to introduce readers to both of these things. Then this is another example. I'd again encourage you to pause it. We have the problem stated first generally, and then the specific purpose statement. So these are the kinds of things you would be building into your research proposals. So that was the end of the problems and purposes component of the screencast. Now we're going to move to the reviewing the literature portion of the screencast. And we'll be covering what is a literature review, how is it organized, standards of adequacy, and poor literature review practices. So the material I'm presenting here comes from sources outside of your readings. It's a little more specific, I find, and it gives you a bit of a checklist to go through as you're writing your own literature reviews. I do find the text to be very useful as well, but I think these slides provide even more specifics about what you might want to look for and try to bring to your literature reviews. So what is a literature review? Well, it's not simply just a listing of research that's been done on a topic. It's actually meant to bring your readers to the current state of knowledge in the field. So the emphasis is on recent studies. Of course, the literature review has to acknowledge the history of where things come, but that should definitely not be the focus. The focus needs to be on recent literature. It helps. It's really important for making sure that we aren't repeating and doing work that's already been done or that isn't at enough level of detail to warrant being done in the first place. So by reviewing the literature, we ensure that we're adding to it, not simply repeating things in a shallow way. The literature review is meant to take that first paragraph, those examples you just read, those problems and purpose statements, and really add detail to them. So it's defining the problem in much more detail. It's one thing to state and cite literature in a paragraph and clarify the problem. It's another thing to back that up with evidence. So the literature review adds detail to your context of the problem that you spell out in your introduction to your proposal. It does tend to place your study in a historical context, but again, that's more of a secondary role of a literature review. It also helps to identify potential new approaches. So by critically reviewing the literature, your goal is to identify potential problems with what's been done as a basis for setting up what you're going to do. So it clearly will point out where new approaches are necessary. By the end of the literature review, it needs to provide a summary of the current opinions, the summary of the current state of affairs, and it needs to synthesize everything into a nice, concise description of where we're at currently. And it comes right after your initial statement of the problem. So if we were thinking of this in terms of the flow of a proposal, you would start off a proposal with a one-page context of the problem. And that would be similar to what you read in those previous two examples we've just shown. Then, after the context of the problem, you've dived right into the literature review and you blow up that one page and you give the detail for all of the claims that are made in the context of the problem and statement of purpose. So how is it organized? Well, there's three main parts. The first part is the introduction, and this is simply just a statement of the scope of the review. So it's putting boundaries on what it is you're going to be talking about and sort of explaining how it will be organized. Then we get to the heart of the review, the critical review itself. Now this isn't a listing, a sequential listing of literature that's been done on the area of interest. It's logically organized in a topical manner, and it's very much related to the broad problem that's being studied. And then you are also focusing on where methods and designs are flawed so that you can point to how your study will improve upon or add to the current understanding of the literature. And finally, the last section of a literature review is the summary. Actually, it's important to note that because this second section of your literature review is the heart of the literature review, it will have many subheadings, and you will organize your literature into subcategories so that you might talk about one group of literature maybe related to one of the variables you're interested in studying. Then you move on to another variable and summarize the literature in that area, and then you might bring those two variables together and talk about any literature that relates them. So again, coming back now to the end, the summary and the synthesis, this is again sort of a one or a shorter part of the literature review, one page part of the literature review, maybe a little longer, where you just bring it all together and you set yourself up to ultimately state the purpose of your study and then even end with your research questions and hypotheses. So the summary and synthesis of the literature is really where you state the purpose of the study and report the questions that you're going to try to answer. So here's an example of what one might be organized like. So we've got study of emotion as their introduction to the literature review. It might be a short section that sort of says this is what the study of emotion is and what it involves. And then you have groupings of literature based on two major constructs, three, shame, guilt, and forgiveness. And then finally, shame, guilt, and forgiveness related to one another, and the synthesis of the literature. So this is from a master's student's thesis, and this is the kind of way we would expect you to organize your literature, as you, even whether it's variable-based research or qualitative research, the same sort of topical organization is what we would expect to see. So this next set of slides is really just the checklist that you should be using in order to ensure that you're writing a high-quality literature review. And you can also use this as a basis for evaluating other literature reviews that you read. So we start with the selection of the literature. Is the purpose of the review indicated? Are the boundaries of the review reasonable? So why were certain bodies of literature included versus excluded? Were there appropriate years of literature included? So this can include the idea that the most recent literature is covered, but also that the most important sort of foundational literature is covered. Were primary sources emphasized in the review as opposed to secondary sources? And primary sources, studies that are directly related to the problem, as opposed to secondary sources, which may be only tangentially related. Again, focusing the review on recent developments, you're going to be asking, is the literature selected relevant to the problem? And that may seem like an obvious question, but it is easy to go down tangents, and so focused reviews are very important. Is the bibliographic data provided complete and accurate? Sometimes it's not the case. I've actually been guilty of this myself. Recently got a review back saying that we cited someone incorrectly, so it's easy to make mistakes. Next, you're going to be looking at the organization of the literature review. So, as stated earlier, it should be organized topically as opposed to chronologically. The review should be organized logically from literature that's more broad or furthest away from the specific problem, and then ending with the literature that's most specifically related to the problem of interest, the purpose of the study. Finally, are the major studies that have spoken to the problem and the purpose covered in detail, because those are the ones that should be focused on as opposed to minor studies with major limitations. Next, you have the critical evaluation of the literature. Is there adequate criticism of the design and methodology of important studies so that the reader can draw their own conclusions, and that you're setting yourself up so that when you explain how you're going to approach or study the problem, you'll be addressing some of the limitations of previous research? Are appropriate comparisons made in order to identify conflicts? This is a really important way to situate your study as necessary. Oftentimes, studies will be published that disagree on the actual way we should be viewing the problem, and so those are going to be very important studies to justify further research. And then, is the relevance of each reference to the problem explicit? If there's a lot of studies that are included that don't seem relevant to the problem, then that's going to be an issue. So the summary and the interpretation should clearly and concisely provide an overall interpretation and understanding of the current state of the problem. It should also lay out the implications and justify why these research questions need to be answered, or hypotheses need to be tested. And it actually should point the reader towards where you're going to be going in terms of methodology. So the literature review will give a hint as to the methods that might be utilized. Number one, because you'll have identified problems with existing methodology, and in doing so, sort of set yourself up to address those problems. So the methodology will sort of logically flow from that. And the last slide I have for you is pitfalls or things to watch out for in terms of poor literature review practices. If the literature review really stands out as a listing of articles or an annotated bibliography, that's a problem. So it needs to be connected to the problem of interest. If it fails to actually criticize what's been done and to identify problems and really just states what's already been done, then they're not really going to have a basis for doing any new research, because identifying gaps and problems with the current state of the literature is a lot of what goes into justifying the need to do your research. And then obviously if it's just disconnected and poorly organized, then it's not going to be a very useful integration of what's out there. So that's all I have for problems and purposes and literature review. Please bring any questions you have about the readings or content to class. We'll be discussing those in addition to going over some of the material from the last set of topics.